Tonight is a special report, and I want to start by saying something up front because tonight's topic is radioactive for a reason. Jeffrey Epstein was not a movie villain. He's a real person, and what happened around him involved real victims, teen girls and often children. And if you're a parent or an aunt or an uncle or a coach, or you have any kid in your life you love, this story should hit a little different. Because these are not abstract victims. These are little girls, some the same age as my kids and some of yours. So here's the deal for the next 30 minutes. I'm going to try to give you the full context as best I can. The timeline, what the government has released, and more importantly, what it hasn't, what Congress is doing now, what the Justice Department role is, and what we the people should demand next. And I'm going to do something I don't see a lot of people doing on this topic. I'm going to separate three things that get blurred together on purpose, I believe. What is proven, what's alleged, and what is imagined or inferred or currently being claimed just simply without evidence. I know it's not sexy and dramatic, but we got to do it this way. If we don't keep the lanes separate, then the only people that are going to win are the pedophiles, the enablers, and the politicians who seem to be more interested in clicks than justice. Now, if you're starting from zero, here's the Epstein 101 in plain English. Jeffrey Epstein was a wealthy financier and a well-connected social figure. For nearly 2 decades, he was accused of sexually abusing underage girls, paying them money, and using a recruitment pipeline where the victims were pressured to bring in even more girls. That's not internet lore. That is the core pattern described by law enforcement and prosecutors. Epstein was arrested in 2019 on federal sex trafficking charges, and before he could go to trial, he died in custody in August of 2019. His associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, was later prosecuted and convicted for her role in recruiting and grooming girls for Epstein, and she was sentenced to prison. So when people say the Epstein Files, what are they actually talking about? Well, they're talking about government records, investigative material, court filings, interview summaries, emails, contact lists, evidence logs, and related documents connected to the Epstein and Maxwell investigations, plus some related investigations like Epstein's death while he was in custody. Some of it is old, some of it's newer, some of it was created by investigators, some of it submitted by the public, some of it reliable, some of it not. And the distinction matters because right now people seem to be treating every screenshot like a conviction. It is not. So let's talk about the big headline everyone's chasing. Names. People want a list of powerful men. They want the client list, a smoking gun roster of monsters. But here's what the government has said, and here's what reporting on the internal records has said. The government has stated that a systematic review found no incriminating client list, and that no credible evidence that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals as part of his actions. That does not mean no one else committed crimes. It means the government is telling us, at least for the time being, that it did not find evidence strong enough to predicate any investigations. So right away you can feel the tension here. The public believes there's more. The government says, based on the review, there is not. And that gap is exactly why this has turned into a fight between Congress and the Justice Department. But to understand the fight, you need the history. Because one of the most important truths about this whole story is this. A lot of the underlying evidence and investigative work is not new. And that's why people keep saying, how has the DOJ had this for years with so little action? Well, let's walk through it. The Epstein story first hits law enforcement in a serious way in the mid-2000s after a tip, and there's a multi-year investigation involving local police and the FBI. That investigation produces a substantial amount of incriminating evidence, and by 2007, federal prosecutors had prepared extensive materials, including a prosecution memo and a draft indictment. So the idea that nobody knew anything until 2019 is simply false. People knew. Investigators knew, prosecutors knew, and of course, the victims all knew, because they all had to live it. But here's the part that still fuels rage to this day. Instead of Epstein being federally indicted in 2007, the case ends up being resolved through a highly controversial non-prosecution agreement and a state plea deal in Florida in 2008, which was unprecedented and unbelievably lenient given the nature of his crimes. So much so that later, the DOJ's own Internal Accountability Office concluded that while it did not find professional misconduct by the DOJ attorneys, it did find that the victims were not treated with the forthrightness and sensitivity expected, and it concluded that the U.S. attorney at the time exercised poor judgment in resolving the case through the non-prosecution agreement. And of course, this feeds directly to the public's core question. Was Epstein protected? Was there a failure of justice? Or worse, did the justice system bend to wealth and power? You don't need conspiracy theories to recognize that the optics of this and its outcomes were completely unacceptable. And so 11 years pass, and then in 2019, federal prosecutors in New York arrest Epstein and charge him with sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. Again. The indictment alleges a scheme in New York and Florida involving dozens of underage victims and the recruitment pipeline, where victims were again paid to recruit other underage girls. This might have been the moment where you first heard about Jeffrey Epstein. That 2019 case is the moment the world finally begins to focus on this dirtbag. And then Epstein dies before trial. But that then ignites a second wildfire, because many people don't trust the ridiculous official conclusion. Both the FBI and the DOJ have stated they concluded Epstein died by suicide, and they cite video review and some investigative findings. But they've also openly admitted that basically all of the prison systems that night and procedures that are to prevent high-profile and high-risk inmates from suicide all simultaneously failed. The 30-minute rounds and counts that ensure guards keep an eye on each inmate, they weren't done that night. They said the guards fell asleep or that they were on their phones. And then they lied about it and filled out false reports, falsely claiming that they did do the rounds and the counts. They said that his required cellmate that had been with him in the weeks prior suddenly wasn't in the cell that night to prevent him from suicide, and no other inmate was available. And what's the one thing that keeps happening every time something important happens that should be easily verifiable by video? Yep. The official report says that 10 out of the 11 cameras monitoring the shoe that night mysteriously malfunctioned. Really? 10 out of the 11 cameras all died in the most secure wing of one of the most secure facilities in the world. And you should see the footage from the miraculous 11th camera. It's a bit tough to swallow that in 2019, the video doesn't look any clearer than that. In fact, the 11th camera's video was so bad that it was conveniently dubbed too grainy and unclear to be able to conclude anything from it. And my personal favorite? 2 weeks ago, some very interesting documents surfaced from that large Epstein file dump. They show that FBI investigators took significant efforts to locate a couple people who anonymously claimed to have inside information that Epstein did not meet his end the way the official story says. The claim is that instead, a couple hours before Epstein's alleged suicide, someone smuggled him out in a wheelchair and into an unmarked van, swapping him with a lookalike. Crazy story at the time, but turns out FBI subpoenas of the 4chan website, of Citibank, and of AT&T were all used to tie this crazy story to its actual source. Turns out the crazy swap-out story was posted by none other than one of the prison guards, a captain working in the SHU the night Epstein died. Now, of course, you can believe what you want, but despite there being some very suspicious details of the official story that probably warrant a follow-up, I'd encourage you not to conclude anything until we have evidence in hand that contradicts the official story. Now, let's fast forward to the documents, the Epstein Files. For years, there were smaller releases of documents here and there through litigation or media investigations, civil cases, court records, etc. But what's different now is that Congress actually passed a law late last year, specifically forcing the DOJ to publish a large body of Epstein-related records. And they were even given a deadline, 30 days. Now, this is very important because this is not normal for Congress to do that. This is not routine. This is Congress basically saying to the Department of Justice, we do not trust you to handle this quietly. So what's the state of the release right now? Well, the DOJ says it has published nearly 3.5 million pages in compliance with the new law, including an additional release at the end of January that included more than 2,000 videos and 180,000 images. The DOJ also says their collection efforts identified more than 6 million pages as potentially responsive. They overcollected to ensure transparency, and that the materials not produced fall into categories like duplicates or privilege-based withholding or statutory exceptions like victim identifying info, child sexual abuse material, and other unrelated items. They also say approximately 200,000 of the pages were redacted or withheld based on privileges like deliberative process, work product, or attorney-client privilege. And critically, the DOJ says they'll submit to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees a report listing categories released and withheld, a summary of redactions and legal bases, and a list of all the government officials and politically exposed people who were named or referenced in the released materials. So Congress's role is now not just theater. Congress has oversight power, and Congress is positioned to do three things. One, they can demand the promised reporting and hold hearings on whether the DOJ complied with both the letter and the spirit of the law. Two, they can actually personally review the unredacted versions of all of these important documents. And three, they can legislate again if the current law is being interpreted in a way that Congress believes defeats its intent. Now, there are two names you're seeing come up a lot of late in relation to Congress's recent spike in activity related to all this. Specifically, Representatives Thomas Massey, who's a Republican from Kentucky, and Ro Khanna, who's a Democrat from California, who, quick side note, they deserve a lot of credit for putting their careers and more on the line to ensure these crimes don't go unpunished. A lot of credit, but I digress. Their involvement matters because it represents a bipartisan pressure campaign, and it reflects something very rare in Washington, that there's a shared belief that the public is being slow-walked here. We're being filtered or managed or worse. But we need to be careful. There's a thin line between transparency here and recklessness. We have already seen what happens when that line gets crossed. There was a moment where names of previously redacted alleged perpetrators were read out publicly as if they were hidden. And the Department of Justice had to quickly clarify that several of the names had no ties to Epstein at all, but were simply part of a photo lineup. And that's a perfect example of why this topic is so dangerous. Because if you start turning being mentioned in a file into being guilty, you'll destroy innocent lives. And you'll also make it easier for the truly guilty to hide behind all that chaos. So if the goal here is justice, we need to keep this really tight and really disciplined. Now let's talk about what was actually released and what it tells us. The Epstein Files release is made up of approximately 3 million documents of various types. There are documents that show the mechanics of how investigators worked the case, who they interviewed, and how they evaluated evidence. There are logs, communications, and attachments. There's obviously material that's deeply sensitive, hence all the redactions of the victim identifying information. And the DOJ has been pretty upfront about the fact that because of the sheer size and volume of this file dump, that it may inadvertently include private or personally identifiable information. And they've provided an email address for the public to report issues. So even the DOJ is admitting something important. They're saying that this release is so massive and so messy that errors are possible. And errors have happened, including redaction mistakes and documents appearing and then disappearing. That's not a talking point. That's the reality of a giant data dump under political pressure. Now, what's incriminating in these files? Well, there's two types of incriminating here. First, incriminating of Epstein himself, the pattern, the pipeline, the payments, the grooming, the exploitation. And second, incriminating of other people. And these require very different standards. Incriminating of Epstein is well established. Multiple victims, corroborating investigative work, the Maxwell conviction, the patterns described by prosecutors. But incriminating other people requires specificity. Did someone commit a crime? Did they knowingly facilitate a crime? Did they pay for victims? Did they transport victims? Did they obstruct justice? Did they recruit? Did they threaten? Did they cover? And this is where the conversation becomes a mess, because people keep jumping from here's a name to here's a criminal. But a name in a contact list is not a crime. A name in an email thread is not a crime. A photo with Epstein is not a crime. A flight log entry is not, on its own, a crime. It can be a lead. It can be suspicious. You can find it morally disgusting. I do. But it's not proof on its own. It's very clear that Epstein was connected into a large portion of upper society. Apparently, he knew everybody. He was at every party. He took photos with thousands of people, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, contact with Epstein was so ubiquitous in some circles that Prince Andrew's ex, Lady Victoria Hervey, recently came out and quoted, "If you're not in the Epstein files, it just means that you were a bit of a loser." So it's complicated. This hunt for justice means weeding through hundreds or even thousands of people whose sin was simply being around Epstein and determining who amongst them are the actual monsters. Okay, so what does the release material suggest in a responsible way? Well, it suggests Epstein had a wide network of contacts, social ties, and institutional touchpoints. It suggests that he cultivated access, including after he was a known sex offender. It suggests systems failed, and sometimes those failures look like incompetence, and sometimes they look like cowardice. It also suggests, according to the reporting on the internal memos, that while investigators did collect strong proof of Epstein's abuse of the underage girls, officially they found scant evidence that he led a sex trafficking ring serving powerful men, and that seized videos and photos did not depict victims being abused or implicate anybody else. Now, of course, that explanation is deeply unsatisfying, especially to those of us that have been scouring through these documents and finding some unbelievably disturbing trends, even with all the redactions. But if we're going to do this right, the official narrative remains important, because it means the most viral version of this story, the one where there's a neat roster of villains and the government has receipts for all of them, is just not what the internal record supports so far. So if someone tells you, see, proof that there are hundreds of powerful people that are rapists, they're trying to sell you certainty that they don't have. And conversely, if someone tells you, well, this proves nobody else did anything, well, they're also trying to sell you certainty that they don't have. The truth, most likely, sits in the uncomfortable middle there. Epstein was a prolific abuser. There were enablers. There were recruiters. There were people who should have known. There were people who ignored obvious red flags. And there may be criminal conduct beyond what has been charged so far, but proving that in court is hard, especially years later, especially with sealed material, privilege, statutes of limitation, and of course, having to rehash this with the victims who have already been through hell and back. So then what about all the theories flying around? Well, let's name the big ones. Theory number one, the hidden client list. The DOJ and FBI have said they've found no incriminating client list. Now, does that mean there's no names in the files? Obviously not. In fact, surfacing some of the names scattered all over these documents looks to be a big priority for Congress at the moment. But it does mean that there's not a single document that functions as a list of clients for trafficking that they've considered incriminating, at least not yet. Theory number two, blackmail. The DOJ and FBI have said that they found no credible evidence that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals as part of his actions. But blackmail remains one of the most common theories about Epstein. The story usually involves him luring powerful people into compromising situations, videotaping their sins, and then using it to manipulate them. So with no credible evidence, why does this theory persist? Well, it could be because every single powerful person that's remotely close to this investigation is acting exactly how they would if they were being blackmailed. Deafening silence, eternal inaction, obvious lack of transparency, no prosecutions, no one in prison. This thing reeks of a cover-up, enough to where Congress has now had to grab the DOJ by the throat to get them to move. And every time Pam Bondi or Kash Patel or any one of these guys gets on the microphone, they just make it worse. And now that I'm on a rant, here's a couple tips for the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. Pam, when you're sitting in front of the House Judiciary Committee answering questions about an alleged global ring of pedophiles with actual victims of said abuse sitting beside you, when you get asked whether the DOJ owes an apology to those victims, the fucking answer is yes. Yes, of course we owe them an apology. The system has failed them. We are all responsible, and we owe an apology to every victim whose perpetrators go unpunished. Not, this is political theater, or I'm not going to get into the gutter. And when asked about the DOJ's lack of action, lack of prosecutions, over-redactions, under-redactions, etc., please do us a favor. Either lie convincingly or tell the truth convincingly, but please don't deflect into a, well, the stock market's doing really well, let's talk about that tirade. It makes you guys look guilty as hell. But again, I digress. Theory number three, intelligence ties and a protected operation. People claim Epstein was an asset, or that he was protected because of his intelligence relationships, commonly assumed to be either Mossad or CIA or whatever. But we simply don't have any concrete evidence of that. There's a lot of suspicion, sure. Maxwell's father's alleged ties to Mossad, Epstein's documented close ties to some of the Israeli leadership, and of late, a discovery that some FBI informants reported that they believed he was a trained Israeli spy. But none of this is confirmed. Could there be undisclosed information? Sure, possibly. But we're not going to build our worldview on possibly. Certainly not something this important. All right. Theory number 4 is that Epstein was murdered. The government maintains he died by suicide. And they cite the video review and investigations cited earlier. But as discussed, there are a lot of suspicious elements of this theory, some more fantastical than others, but no real evidence yet. Now, here's how we tie patterns to these theories without all the tinfoil hat conspiracy nonsense. We can say this. Epstein clearly used access, money, and status as a tool. He surrounded himself with prestige, and he used that prestige as camouflage. He built a recruitment tunnel. He had properties, travel, staff, and logistics that supported abuse. And institutions that had opportunities to stop him did not, at least not fast enough and not fully enough. Now, this doesn't require a global conspiracy. It requires something more common and more depressing. It requires a series of human failures: greed, fear, laziness, and deference to power. So where does the Department of Justice fit into this? And why are people so angry at the DOJ specifically? Well, there's a few distinct criticisms. One, the 2006 to 2008 era outcome. The DOJ's own internal review concluded that victims were not treated with the forthrightness expected, and it criticized the judgment used in resolving the federal investigation through the non-prosecution agreement. Second, the pace. A lot of the investigative history is old, and there were years where Epstein remained a free man after a lenient deal and public trust was broken. And then, of course, third, the transparency. Congress had to force a law to compel the release. And even with that law, there's been disputes about redactions, missing files, and whether the release was handled in a way that protects victims while informing the public. And fourth, the question that never goes away: if the files are this big and the case is this notorious and Epstein harmed so many victims, why have there not been more prosecutions? Now, we need to be fair, even while we're being demanding. Prosecuting additional people requires admissible evidence, credible witnesses, and a legal theory that can survive court. And a name in a document is not that. A rumor is not that. A publicly submitted tip off a tip line could be false. A redacted page might be redacted because it contains victim information, not because it contains some protected VIP. But at the same time, the DOJ is not entitled to blind trust. They've abused that privilege. Not after the history of this, not after 2008, not after years of sealed material and slow disclosures. If the DOJ wants its trust back, it needs to earn it. And the path to earning it is not yelling at the public. It's providing clarity. What was withheld and why? And in categories that people can understand. What redaction rules were applied consistently? What materials remain sealed by the courts? What materials are privileged? And are privilege claims legitimate, or are they simply embarrassing to people? And are any ongoing investigations happening? And if not, why not? Now let's talk about what's next and what you should probably expect. First, expect politics. People will use this story as a weapon against their enemies and a shield for their buddies. We can't let them. Second, you're going to expect misinformation as usual. Fake documents, edited screenshots, AI-generated lists, people claiming that they have the real files when they don't. Remember, there's one clear and definitive source for the Epstein Files, and that's the official DOJ website. In this age of AI fakes and internet trolls, it's important to maintain a baseline of truth here. And third, I'd expect some distractions. Now, diversions can come in many forms, but don't be so naive to think that if this thing blows open and it backs the most powerful people on the planet into a corner, that they wouldn't use every avenue available to them. False flags, outrage cycles, culture war bait, starting a war, anything to move your attention away from the victims and their long overdue justice. And on a related side note, did anyone catch that little aliens are real reveal that Obama pulled the other day? Really? 8 years as president and 10 years since, and all of a sudden now, on the eve of the potentially largest scandal reveal in our lifetime, one that could take down the most powerful people in the world, you suddenly decide to drop the aliens bomb. Huh. Nothing suspicious about that. Okay, so what should we actually demand moving forward? Well, we should demand that the DOJ deliver the report it said it would deliver to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees and include a clear summary of categories withheld, legal basis, the list of government officials, and the politically exposed people that were referenced. We should demand a transparent redaction standard and an independent audit process to ensure that victim privacy is protected while avoiding arbitrary hiding of non-victim names. We should also demand that Congress conduct serious oversight hearings, not clown show hearings like we saw the other day, real hearings. Redaction experts, victim advocates, investigators, prosecutors, judges, the works. We should demand that state authorities also examine what happened within their jurisdictions, because federal action is not the only path to accountability here. And we should demand some victim-centered support, get some resources for the survivors, and some reforms maybe that reduce the ability of powerful offenders to buy leniency. Now, what could happen if this turns out to be a massive cover-up? Well, if there were provable obstruction, provable concealment, provable destruction of evidence, provable abuse of classification or privilege, then yeah, this would be a constitutional crisis level scandal. It would trigger Inspector General scrutiny, special counsel decisions, congressional investigations, and potentially criminal charges for anyone who broke the law. But importantly, we don't get to declare massive cover-up just because we're unsatisfied with the answer. You declare it when you can prove it. And until then, the ethical stance is pressure for transparency, not scandal assumptions. All right, I'm going to close with this. The reason this matters is not because it's juicy or because it involves famous people or because it gives people an excuse to dunk on political opponents. This matters because kids were hurt. Little girls were recruited and then pressured and paid, isolated and then abused. Some of them carry that trauma into adulthood. Some of them have spent years trying to simply be believed or even heard. And every single time the public turns this into a circus, every time someone doxes the wrong person, every time someone uses a victim's pain as a political prop, it mocks these poor girls, and it just makes justice harder. I'm angry. And if you're angry, good. Be angry. And just as importantly, stay angry. But aim it properly. Aim it at systems that failed. Aim it at the people who enable these animals. Aim it at anything that allows wealth and power to buy softer landings. And aim it in a way that helps, not harms. Because here's the honest and unpleasant truth that we might have to accept. The simplest answer might just be the most obvious and least dramatic one. Epstein was a monster, and the world around him contained a lot of cowards, a lot of opportunists, and a lot of people who simply didn't want to see what was right in front of them. And that's bad enough. And if later the facts eventually prove something bigger, a broader criminal enterprise, deliberate protection, organized obstruction, then we'll face that truth too. But let's not skip steps. Let's follow the evidence, let's protect victims, and let's demand accountability like adults. Now, if you're watching this and you're a survivor, please know you're not alone. We see you, we hear you, and we hurt for you. And if you're watching this and you're a parent, do not let this become just another story you scroll past. These days, I know it's tempting. We seemingly deal with one life-altering scandal after another every other week. But this is different. This is bigger. And it's a direct challenge to the most important thing that we're all required to do to protect our children. So go home. Talk to your little ones. Talk to them constantly. Ask them tough questions. Follow up on anything they seem uncomfortable with. Watch for the grooming patterns and take their discomfort seriously. And if you're watching this and you're one of the people in power, in the DOJ, in Congress, in media, in finance, anywhere near the levers, understand this. This is not going away. I'm not going away. The public is not going away. And the victims are certainly not going away. And this time, we are not accepting trust us as an answer. We insist on the truth. We insist on justice. And you need to do it without destroying any more innocent people along the way. Because this is about kids. Little kids. Innocent kids whose lives have been shattered by these assholes. And they deserve better. So that's all for now. Thank you for watching. I'm Jared Bennett. This is Sugar Cereal. Good night.